Well, dear listeners, tonight I want to introduce a brilliant writer, a man of many gifts, and a character that bent toward betrayal, opportunism, chosen National Socialism, every harsh epithet earned, every ribbon pinned by his own hand, yet none of that cancels the brute genius on the page. Do morality and art always go hand in hand? I ask it beside a microphone, because a microphone behaves like a confessional box built by electricians. It takes breath, turns breath into authority, sends authority into kitchens, cars, late-night beds. A voice can soothe while it teaches, can charm while it tightens a rope. I learned that long before I read him, standing in rooms where a joke bought forgiveness, where a clever cadence could make cruelty sound like sense, where virtue wore the polite coat of order. The ear loves pattern, the ear forgives pattern. That fact alone gives every artist a dangerous kind of priesthood. Our subject wrote as if language held a stethoscope to the chest of Europe. He heard panic, exhaustion, hunger, petty vanity, grand fear, then made music from the diagnosis. The same throat later spat pamphlets that trained the sentence into a weapon, aiming it at living neighbors with the zeal of a convert. Talent stayed intact, conscience shifted its allegiance, so the question grows sharper than gossip. A library shelf holds more than books, it holds permissions. What permission do you grant when you praise a style that dazzles, when you quote a line that sings, when you feel your own ribs answer before your judgment rises? Tonight I keep the beauty in view, I keep the filth in view, and I ask you to stand where both weigh the same, until your own restraint begins to feel like an action. A riddle for the gentlemen nearest the door, where corridor light cut across their shoes like a magistrate's glance, when a man balanced a spool of lace thread in one hand, a war medal in the other, which object governed his sentences, the thread that drew pattern into grace, or the metal that drew authority down upon flesh. I set the question on my desk beside a worn copy of Voyage about de la Nuit, close enough for the paper's sour breath to mingle with chalk dust, close enough for the cover to shine where a thumb had worried it through years of handling, so that the room leaned toward the object as cattle lean toward salt, slow yet certain, beneath a bodily pull that began in the palm, then travelled toward language. My palm stayed flat upon the cover as though a catechism required contact, as though mass rose from gutter talk, clinic smell, trench mud, colonial forms, each fragment fitted into an altar that left soot on a white cuff, while Céline's name lived in French letters as a tool long before it lived in a breathing person, the name travelling through print plus talk, until each station sharpened it, each edge cutting a fresh conscience, each cut teaching the body a small lesson in complicity, politics crouched at the back, a visiting relation breathing over tea, as every Irish hall taught me early. I carried the memory of rooms where clever men slipped tainted beauty beneath a coat and smiled, trusting the mouth's small curve to purchase mercy, while the same bargain lay warm in my own pockets, as a country's quarrels pressed toward a lecturer's tidy desk, into a book lifted from a shop, into a corridor remark, until guilt sat there with the heft of a stone warmed by a turning palm, hunting a clean visage for a stained inheritance. A domestic scene offered the first honest scale. His mother bore the name Marguerite Louise Céline Guillou, who ran a lace business in Paris, as his father carried the name Fernand Destouches through an insurance office, after which Frédéric Vitoux traced that household with a bailiff's patience, reading the rooms as an inventory in motion, fastening one address to one wage until a quarrel rose from the paper and a debt settled back into it, setting the boy inside an economy of thread plus paperwork, where openwork taught the IA, discipline of minute change through a gap's eloquence, through mending performed by modest hands that kept their labour plain before the street, as the policy ledger taught the mind its columns, its liability, its evening ease when the figures closed, an ease carrying kitchen theology in its apron. Lace-making entered my own life far from Paris, for Yule gave me bobbins clicking like small bones beside the Blackwater reeds, as Colonial offered a rosette bright against a palm browned by potato soil. Those two places taught a strand its passport, then taught the skin its price, so that a needle's kiss carried sweetness plus threat, as a seam held a garment together at the very moment the same seam veiled damage from a hostile eye, virtue turning into clothing sewn for display. Céline's childhood shop lived in my mind as a chapel of imagination, where devotion took the form of attention in a city of loud coin, so that a woman brought a torn strip of antique lace, laid it on the counter with offering reverence, then received a promise of restoration, whose paradox a child learned before theology, as mending reached for fidelity to a pattern, while disguise tempted the fingers, for a fresh filament passed for an original, and a skilled hand laid a new surface over injury, after which that paradox governed the sentence, making it carry street talk into literature, through the same act that carried bodily hurt into metaphysical complaint, letting profanity keep pace with a cadence that held faint choir music beneath mud. Henri Godard read that force within French prose, treating rupture as an event bearing ethical charge, the shift in what a sentence allowed a man to enact upon his reader. A snapped line could echo a cough or a surge of panic. Cadence struck conscience like a driven nail. The lace lesson returned as patient labor moved beside concealment, while loyalty slid into disguise through one choreography of fingers. Mercy took delight in letting injury slip beneath a smooth face. The savor ripened into a habit of wiping marks, feeding an appetite for sheen, with gloss paraded as righteousness. War arrived as correction, piercing a clerk's dream through indifferent machinery, so Destouches entered the army as asset, then left as damaged property, bearing a wound that refused tidy arithmetic, holding a decoration that glittered like a chalice lifted above blood. The novel turned that prize into theatre, for the Republic's sanctifying gaze became stage light as torn flesh waited offstage, veiled yet active, lending rancid savour to the scene. That emblem carried two visages, one bright with public consecration, another weighted with recollection of fear, tightening the throat as breath, locked in the chest like a stolen coin. Such doubleness tied an early knot, as institutional sanctity tasted watery, while craving for sanctity with bite drove a mind toward shrines built from strange materials, where intensity hardened into cleansing rite and grief found a creditor. Medicine gave a method for reading bodies, plus a lens for weighing society, for the physician read want as illness written on skin, while disease carried want's footprint. In 1924 he submitted a thesis on Ignaz Semmelweis, the obstetrician whose insistence upon hand hygiene drew hostility that tightened around him until solitude ended in ruin. That choice showed a taste for embattled veracity, shaping a story in which a solitary figure saw straight while official power kept inherited obscurity, until the clinic supplied proof and hygiene governed the hand. Later, that same scaffold returned when dirt in the public soul received a single face, gathering imagined conspiracy around it, as grief demanded a culprit pinned to a page, a debtor chased until the account shut. Insurance completed the household theology, turning chance into premium through dockets that taught domestic speech a pose of mastery over fortune. A child raised among papers learned harm as something decipherable, while that promise of safety carried an underside, for a world that looked legible invited the mind to seek a culprit for every wound. A register craved closure, rewarding the clerk who assigned cost to cause, until neatness turned savage when life handed over a splinter set upon a table as evidence before neighbours beneath a pious face. Within the lecture chamber I carried temptation. Starched collars kept brightness, each listener reached for tag serving moral seal, latch click of closure. Judgment brought ease at bargain price. Hunger paid, guilt named it order. Behind me a fellow with plough-coloured palms shifted. Milltown memory tightened in him, gears known by touch, toil-tuning backbone to meter. Brick sheds lived in his mind, with oxidized iron bleeding into riverbank clay. Outside the pane a rook hopped along parapet, seized one crumb, tilted its head. Black eye shone with craving that served creed. That book came like furnace, scandal trailed like smoke. Voyage Bout de la Nuit surfaced in 1932, opening with a gesture aimed at being, as if life lay on a board between bread and knife. I spoke the first line aloud. French syllables dropped like coins into a bowl. Breath ruled tempo. Words struck oak with fist force. Street authority entered literature through flesh. Cracked syntax matching shattered life. Ellipsis made lace gaps audible. Exclamation carried panic spasm. Physiology became ethics that summoned chest before theory rose. Bardamu drifted through warfare and wage world until banlieue streets closed around him. A strain returned, seldom framed as doctrine, asking what dignity survived inside systems that spent flesh. Titles shifted, appetite persisted, bureaus issued sanctifying slogans that hid hunger beneath blessing. He listened until fraud's tune sounded under each polished name. Deceit spoke with assurance, wearing confidence like livery. His ear carried venom, and exposure sweetened into relish that curdled into scorn dressed as truth. In the battle pages a body became object inside a national economy of death. Courage and survival refused harmony, while slaughter chose targets with disregard for costume. Mockery fell on medals, carrying ache from a man hungry for belief. Marrow held treachery, laughter cut like a blade. Grotesque comedy served as spiritual autobiography, a voice gripping one honest lungful as government harvested flesh. The colonial episode sharpened my social vision. Administration pressed on the reader with lash force. Clerk's dullness married exploitation, and civilization served as varnish over quota yard. Sickness gained docket, burial received stamp. That outpost resembled an insurance bureau with rifles among furniture. Desk held forms, gun presence governed silence. Violence lived as posture, even when pen travelled gently. A register returned, hardening expense into justification, shaping racial hierarchy in bureaucratic phrasing until paper claimed life's truth and gore became ink. The American chapters swung into Fordist cadence, bringing forward a second engine, coaxing song from iterative strike, schooling gesture into measure, pressing flesh into component shape, whose living depended upon tempo obedience. So efficiency tasted like seduction while violence sat at core. Domestic ground entered again in costume, because lace prized recurrence tempered by nuance within stitchwork, while factory prized repetition that rinsed nuance away, leaving pattern intact through sameness. I carried the distinction in my nerves like toothache keeping time with heartbeat, each pulse yielding ache, each cycle schooling endurance through pain, endurance turning into rancor with mold's slow certainty. The medical chapters brought him back to France, placing the novel on its most intimate ethical soil, where a physician among the poor herd lives shaped by tenancy under wage pressure, thirst under humiliation, before treated bodies singly, watching communal pattern, mock the promise of private cure. Clinic work laid bandage on torn skin, but that dressing sent a patient toward the same lane, that room, wallpaper holding moisture like sponge, cheap wine on breath, employer's grip unchanged until an ethical base emerged like secular doctrine of inherited misery, where a person entered life beneath conditions, shaping flesh before soul reached adult choice. Compassion carried fury against systems, yet that heat could turn toward the very people it meant to shield, as if vocation bred resentment that tasted like candor to a listener hungry for harsh truth, harshness taken as holiness by men who feared tenderness. At my desk, objects kept abstraction from swallowing faces, so I lifted lace bobbin, then raised stethoscope, setting each on wood like evidence before magistrate. Bobbins belonged to mending plus display, stethoscope belonged to hearing plus diagnosis. Diagnosis promised clarity while courting reduction. Attention could dignify suffering, yet paperwork could turn a person into dossier, ledger line, columnar cipher, so classification felt humane when help arrived, while taxonomy felt cruel when power found convenience. At that threshold, Céline's pamphlets entered the air. The name shifted from style toward hatred. The room stiffened as if timber pressed into backs. Bagatelles, Poor and Massacre entered print in 1937, pushing obsession into typographic fever through slogan rhythm that struck the nerves. L'école des cadavres followed during 1938, with pages turning accusation into doctrine, dogma into liturgy for political cruelty. Les Beaux Draps arrived during 1941 beneath occupation's shadow, carrying scapegoat hunger, humiliation relish, insistence that a ledger required a debtor for every national wound. I watched listeners swallow as though air thickened, as though bell tone rang inside throat. A gentleman spoke near the door, voice carrying turf rasp, question carrying accusation. "Mr. Smallridge," he said, fingers pinching the cap of his pen, "what place belonged to the one who studies within this ugliness?" My eyes stayed on the book while I answered. "Agency belonged to the one who reads," I said. Choice felt like coin within a large pocket, yet purchase remained possible. My sentence came out polished, purity tempted me like bile. Fair diction hid foul motive. Complicity stuck to auditors as well as lecturers, with distance masquerading as innocence, velvet-gloving cowardice. Céline wrote against comfort with relish, forcing minds to feel their share in systems they preferred to place across a river, whose current carried responsibility downstream, then returned it in the taste of well-water drawn at dusk. The dead gathered in my mouth, trench boys, plantation victims, line workers bent to tempo, fever-eaten tenants, Jewish households, whose names vanished into smoke drifting through ash-stained offices. Speech rose from a man reading inside a safer room than theirs, so shame stood as bodily fact within the lecture chamber. Lectures could become opiate, warm bath for the mind, leaving a man soft enough for excuses. Softness welcomed the innocent's fable, voiced by the same tongue that praised literature as if praise washed blood. David Carroll read the pamphlet's rhetoric at sentence pressure, showing verbal manner turning into coercive motor, quickening depiction into incantation, drilling fixation through rhythm, driving caricature toward harmright. His warning bit, because any reader treating ornament as harmless carried lilies into a slaughterhouse, while cadence could snare a heart faster than dogma caught a mind. His wider account of literary fascism set Céline amid nationalist fervour braided with anti-Semitic zeal, dressed in cultural authority, so aesthetic claim served political assault. The page behaving like a baton in a fist schooled for domination. Interwar France lived with trench memory and decline anxiety, with imperial shade pressing on public speech until accounting metaphors ruled, obligations priced in bodies. Robert Soucy traced a later surge of French fascism along those nerves, showing respectable facades sharing pavement with violence, resentment wearing ideological livery across clubs, journals, campaign rostrums. Céline moved within that current, while domestic arithmetic, war injury, martyr tale, street whisper pressed toward a psychic device that settled diffuse suffering by naming an obligor, pinning that figure beneath an official stamp whose certainty tasted like communion to men who feared doubt. Philip Stephen Day treated Céline's novel form as delirious release carrying moral risk, for fevered speech broke decorum even as impulse shed restraint. Inside this chamber, young men sometimes mistook loosened manners for bravery. Discipline tempered by humility faced stain. A voice could name blot in one breath, then demand purification in the next. Such candour gave scant shelter against cruelty that felt righteous to the man who called it cleansing. Bardamu slid from naive enlistment toward corrosive lucidity, as Robinson drifted through opportunism until ruin claimed him. Molly offered care with a brief radiance that felt miraculous, as Alcide carried decent intention trapped inside imperial machinery. Each trajectory read as moral bookkeeping. Capital entered with hope plus loyalty, then the world collected payment through degradation, leaving reprieve as loan binding the borrower through gratitude mixed with shame. Disgrace hardening into chain worn like jewellery. Midway through that my desk lamp flickered once, then held steady, its filament trembling like a nerve. A small insect battered the shade's rim, tapping a faint tick like a cheap clock, while the room carried a scent of wool, ink, paper held by hands. Memory drew me to a ditch in County Offaly, where reeds stood beside black water. A child lifted a rusted button from mud, held it up as treasure, later learning the scrap came from a soldier's coat, a lesson in objects bearing history like burrs, clinging, refusing to fall away, teaching the hand that touch bore consequence, travelling farther than intention. The claim rooted itself in those objects. Voyage read as a book of accounts in a sense deeper than metaphor, its moral imagination, drawing on domestic bookkeeping learned through household trades. Lacework taught mending that can conceal, while policy work taught liability inside balanced columns, and that discipline let the narrative weigh suffering as payable cost, questioning profit through the lens of escape as debt lodged in flesh. The pamphlet showed a ruinous turn of the same arithmetic, when settlement hunger fastened on a community and named it cure for national heat. A listener might ask why brilliance reached for such cruelty. I offered an answer with dirt beneath nails, for forms in an office trained the eye to search residue as needlework trained fingers to disguise a tear, while a medal taught the tongue to save a ceremony, and Semmelweis held up a persecution mirror, with street corner talk vending conspiracy like cheap cigarettes to any mind eager for a named owing. Relief came through certainty, which repetition turned into fate until blood served as ink for the closing entry. At the town's edge a burn slid beneath ash, reshaping the bank through patient wear. I walked there after lectures, collar raised, pockets weighted, thoughts smuggled like contraband. The current taught consequence. Whatever entered travelled onward to strangers' lips, followed that lesson, carrying guilt toward repentance, until responsibility became action touching another life, a discipline rarer than gold, plain on the face, paid in lost sleep. Now the riddle demanded payment, filament or metal. A bobbin taught tension that held pattern while counterfeit hid inside an eloquent gap. A medal taught consecration that staged the state's claim over pain. An account book governed both. Céline's greatness lay in his capacity to score suffering in fresh music, while Céline's disgrace lay in his attempt to close that record by billing a people for the century's grief, So the hand that mended shifted into accusation, the tongue that diagnosed slid into incantation. Jonathan Weiss traced that life through exile with return, showing a self-image of embattled truth-teller born beneath evidence that bruised it, amid consequence that followed it, before judgment that waited, while a coat could warm flesh as it hid blood. I set lace filament on my left hand, the replica medal on my right, holding both in view until the hall tasted wakeful silence. Pattern drew the strand, pageantry beckoned the talisman. A household divinity crouched behind them, insisting every grief find a named debtor. I shut the volume with a flat touch, sealing an account I feared, as paper met board with a soft clap that carried the sole honest conclusion a lecturer could offer when genius yoked to obsession made language harden into wire. Corridor light fell on my shoes at the desk, and restraint in the reader broke the tyranny, the token landing at last.